Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag. I have a very exciting author for you today, but unfortunately I couldn't find the publisher's book. She is published by Duckworth's, and I don't think I have a Duckworth book, so I got this lovely book bag with a very nice quote which seemed appropriate to what we're going to be discussing today. Each time a woman stands up for herself, without knowing it, she stands up for all women. I thought this was a very good motto for the chat that I am now going to have with the very wonderful Ariane Bankes. We're going to be talking about her book, The Quality of Love. It has just been published, hot off the press, getting great reviews. So without more ado, welcome Ariane into the book bag.
Hello, thanks very much for having me.
You're very welcome. I have just finished this book, which I thought was absolutely wonderful. It's such a great read. My first comment really is that by taking a general comment really, which is that this is a story about strong, powerful men, but they're in the background. And by foregrounding women, it seems to me that you have rounded out a story of literary life in the 40s and 50s that is normally only told from one perspective. I mean, it's the story of your mother, it's the story of your aunt. But as somebody who has been a publisher, was this very much on your mind, that this is a story that doesn't get told very often?
Very much so, yes. My mother left me all her papers when she died in 2002. And all my life as I was growing up, she talked to me about she and her identical twin sister, Mamaine. She was called Celia and Mamaine Paget. And they had moved in extraordinary circles. I mean, all sort of most of the great intellectuals of the middle of the last century were, if not friends, then lovers and possibly even husbands or would-be husbands. So I knew there was a story there to tell, but very much from an informal, oblique and feminine perspective. So they were very close to some of these people. And what I loved in their letters to one another, they wrote to one another constantly when they were apart. And because they were very grounded in Europe, and also because my aunt Mamaine was living with and then married to Arthur Koestler, who was an endlessly restless individual. He couldn't stay put in one place for more than 2 years at the absolute outside, mostly a few months, and then he was off somewhere else. So they were constantly traveling. And whenever the twins were apart, they wrote to each other weekly if they could, sometimes even more frequently than that. And of course, they gave their own very droll, dispassionate view of the world in which they found themselves, of these great men, in quotes, I suppose. But from as I say, from a very informal and very and rather subversive angle, I would say. I mean, they took them, of course, they took them seriously. They took them enormously seriously as thinkers, writers, and intellectuals. But they were all too open to their foibles, let's put it that way, as human beings. And that comes so loud and clear in their letters. And that's what makes their letters so vivid and often so very funny as well.
So it's a story, we have Orwell in its pages, we have Camus, the aforementioned Koestler, Sartre, de Beauvoir. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. I mean, anybody sort of thinking, politicking, philosophizing, Freddie Eyre is in it as well. Seem to be part of their circle. When you were looking at the letters, is there any sense that they're written in a kind of impenetrable code because they were twins? And was there anything when you read them when you thought, I don't know what they're getting at, or are they brilliantly entertaining and perfectly easy to read?
I mean, occasionally they would refer to people by just the first letter of their name. And when these were not people in their regular circle. I wasn't able always to tell who those individuals were, but they were not so important because they were not in their regular circle. But actually, even though they were twins and understood each other almost telepathically, they wrote long and gossipy and chatty and event-filled letters. And I was very rarely sort of hamstrung and unable to follow them. And what was lovely for me was that, as I say, I'd grown up hearing my mother's stories. But of course, when you're young, you never sort of take notes or remember whether it was July or August or 1946 or 1949 or whatever. And so it was with the aid of the letters that I was finally able to actually chart the course of their peripatetic and very busy parallel lives and put them into a pattern that made sense to me and that obviously I hoped makes sense to the reader. I mean, I have to say that I had to leave an enormous amount on the cutting room floor because I did have to create a narrative. And, you know, their lives were so busy. They knew so many people. They were involved in so many different activities and journeys and everything that it could have been a ragbag if I hadn't been rather ruthless in my selection.
Yeah, I mean, the story that you tell, it encompasses the life of Mamane, whom you never knew, and there is this very strong sense in the book that you're getting to know her in a way. She's a very vivid character, as is Celia, your mother. Did you have a kind of double vision when you were writing it? Like, on the one hand, this is Mum. On the other hand, this is this gorgeous girl cutting a swathe through. Could you bring two sides together in a way?
I could, because they were so very closely, intimately linked with one another. And although it wasn't exactly a code, you know, they did have, in a sense, a sort of language that they shared, and you know, a group of people they were both deeply familiar with. You know, they knew all of each other's friends. They shared their taste in music, in literature, in their love of the countryside, their love of birds. They adored birds and birdsong. They loved music. They were both extremely musical. They really shared absolutely everything. The thing is that many more of Mamane's letters survive than my mother's do. That's because Mamane was traveling, as I say, so very much with Arthur. They moved house 5 or 6 times during the 6 years they were together. And I think that a lot of my mother's letters simply got lost in the moves, whereas my mother was more stable. I mean, she went to Paris for 3 years, but other than that, she was in England. And she did keep every one of Mamane's letters. I have enormous numbers of them. So I have many more of Mamane's letters to draw on than my mother's. But of course, I can tell from Mamane's replies to my mother's letters what she would have been writing to her about, etc. So I can extrapolate a lot. Yeah. And they were both, you know, they were both constantly in touch.
Did you find out things about your mother while you were writing the book, or had she told you more or less everything while she was alive?
I did. I mean, there were no great surprises because I was extremely close to my mother and she kept very little back from me. But I think that she was still unable to really convey the depth of her sadness at Mamane's death. Mamane died at the age of 37 of asthma. And it was absolutely devastating to my mother, who just got married to my father. I mean, it was, Mamane died 3 weeks after their marriage date. And she was everything to my mother in the sense that they were identical twins, they were siblings, they had no other siblings. And they were orphaned when they were 12 years old. Their mother had died as a result of giving birth to them. And their father, whom they absolutely loved and was the center of their universe in their childhood, died when they were 12 years old. So they were then farmed out to rich relations. But really throughout that, they were each other's closest and most beloved companions in everything. And they kept each other going, really, you know, during the highs and lows of each other's lives. So it was devastating for my mother, and it did take her quite some time to recover from that. And she never really talked about those dark times, and I wouldn't have expected her. And how can you convey that, especially to a child or a young person, really? But that, of course, does come through. I was able to sort of intimate that from other letters that she received from friends about the name, and that
Yes.
she wrote in her turn.
I mean, there's a terribly touching detail that they'd actually said to each other that they wouldn't go to each other's funeral. You know,
Yes.
it would be too much. I mean, I don't want to skip to the end of the story too much, but I mean, you've outlined, you know, this rather strange beginning of life that they had. They have this idyll with their father. The trunk seems to have belonged to him. Is that right? It had his initials on it. So
exactly.
this is
Exactly.
the trunk with all the precious letters in it. So then they have this very strange period with an eccentric but very rich. Is he an uncle or
an uncle, aunt, and two cousins? Yes, living in a vast house in Roehampton called Ibstock Place. It's now actually an independent school. And there were 18 servants for a family of 4, which became a family of 6 when they joined. But 18 servants, quite something. And, you know, it was palatial.
Yes, it's social history as well, really, isn't it? Because the other things that the girls have to do is they have to come out, which is be debutantes and do all of that, which they seem to have found excruciating. But were you aware that they had been, in effect, celebrities? They were kind of it girls, weren't they? They were the sort of people that we see now in the papers who go to parties and have fun.
Yes, I was very aware, because actually my mother kept absolutely none of the newspaper cuttings, because she'd found the whole episode so boring and such a waste of time. But my Paget relations had vast scrapbooks filled with newspaper cuttings from the time. They were the darlings of the press. They were snapped, they were written about, their clothes were commented on. They were really never out of the press's eye, because being so identical and being so beautiful and being very vivacious, and they were Debs of the year, and they had to do the season not once but twice, because they were determined not to get engaged to any of the sort of, you know, rather vacant young men they met on the dance floor. So their aunt, in despair, put them through it a second time, much to their rage and fury. And they only managed to escape at the age of 21, when they inherited a small legacy from their father, which gave them the freedom to branch out on their own. And they never looked back.
They were both quite intellectual, and I think you make the point that they would have been blue stockings if they had had the chance, but they didn't really have the chance, did they? It wasn't the done thing, I guess.
First, they weren't even sent to school till they were 10. Then they were sent to some very dismal girls' boarding schools. And because of their father's illness and death, they were in a very bad frame of mind. So even if they had been good schools, I don't think either of them would have learnt very much at them. But then when they were 15, because of their asthma, which was a chronic condition, they developed it on the death of their father. It's actually it can be a psychosomatic condition, and I think in their case it was. They were sent away to a finishing school in Switzerland. So from the age of 15 to 18, they spent in this actually lovely finishing school above Lausanne, overlooking the Lake of Geneva, where they met some wonderfully attractive European and American girls who really introduced them to European culture. They learned French. They were very good linguists. They had a marvelous ear, being so musical. And my mother was a brilliant linguist, and they immediately learned French. They picked up pretty good German, pretty good Italian from these other girls that they were at school with. And they made great friends throughout Europe, actually, which sort of fueled a great spate of traveling. Once they came into their own little legacy and had a bit of money, they were off to visit them all over the place. And it gave them a very European outlook on life, which my mother had to the day she died. In fact, she used to read French books for publishers and give her opinion on them, and sometimes German books too. In fact, she was really European in her outlook.
that whole episode reminded me so much of those antiquated books now, the Chalet School. I felt like they'd been to the Chalet School, you know, with learning languages and mixing with all kinds of Europeans, and also the thing of going for their health, which
Yes.
was a thing of the era. And in fact, I mean, Mamane's sad fate is to live in a lot of damp and drafty houses, which wasn't, you know, as Arthur Koestler kind of dragged her here and there. I mean, Wales doesn't come across very well in
It
this
was
book, I'm
always,
afraid.
as far as I can remember from her letters, it was virtually always raining. And at one point, the window in their house literally fell in on them in the middle of a gale. And the whole sitting room was sort of flooded with lashings of rain. It was a pretty bad climate. They lived in Western Snowdonia, just above Blaenau Ffestiniog, and it was rough up there. But Arthur loved, he loved, interestingly, loved the wilds. And as I say, he was a very restless character. And he felt he needed to get away from London in order to focus on his writing and just not be interrupted endlessly by other people.
So it is a story that you probably had to keep control of, because they are whizzing around, they're meeting all kinds of exciting people. People are publishing books and making programs on the TV, and George Orwell is there, and, you know, radio production and all this kind of thing. It's really non-stop, this whirl, and the travels as well. But Paris was very important. France was very important. And as I read the story, partying and drink is very important. And I sort of think, you know, we think kind of young folk today, or, you know, I think they would blanch at the amount of partying, certainly that Mamone did. You know, there's a lot of going to bed at 8 a.m., isn't there? And you know, up all night.
Yes, but that was really
Sartre and de Beauvoir.
Well, that was really all led by Arthur, and probably by Sartre. I mean, Arthur was a terrific drinker, and very disputatious, and he loved a party, particularly one where he could have an argument with people. And actually, Mamone, if she'd been left to her own devices, she would have loved to have spent a lot of her evenings at home, playing the piano, reading books, going to bed at 10 o'clock. But she was married to Arthur, so off they went. And yes, they really went out, you know, they really went out on the town. Absolutely. And there's some wonderful descriptions of these evenings where they moved from a restaurant to a bar, to a Spanish nightclub, to a Russian nightclub, drinking champagne, drinking vodka, drinking God knows what, and landing up, as you say, sort of staggering home at 8 o'clock in the morning and going to bed for the rest of the day. Yes. I mean, it didn't happen that often, but it certainly happened, you know, and she writes about it very amusingly, because it was an extraordinary way to live your life.
And at the same time, Mamone is helping Arthur Koestler a great deal. You know, she's one of the unsung heroines of literature, which she doesn't seem to have resented at all. But, you know, being the amanuensis, being the secretary, helping a great man.
I mean, she knew the deal with Arthur was that he was a writer first and foremost, and that if she was going to live with him, she was going to have to knuckle under and help him in his tasks. So she was scribe, sounding board, secretary. I must say, she did bitterly resent the amount of time that she spent on his work, as opposed to, as it were, developing her own interests. I mean, at one point she says, you know, when Arthur's giving dictation, my face is so full of boredom, loathing, and despair that he can hardly bear to continue with the dictation. But she knuckled under, and she did it because she believed in him as a writer, and she believed in him as a thinker. And she really put herself second in that respect, which is rather, you know, uncontemporary of her. But remember that this was the middle of the 1940s, way beyond really the the rise of feminism. And actually, these twins were very independent, and she was defiant. One of the reasons that Arthur adored her was because she did stand up to him in many respects, but she also put his works centrally to her life as well as to his, because there was absolutely no point in being with him otherwise. He was a very difficult man, but he was a brilliant writer. And that is why she stuck with him for as long as she did.
They were rebellious, both girls. They pursued kind of love wherever it led them. They you know, as you've said, they went through this Deb thing, and I'm sure there was some, you know, some chaps with large houses and lots of money who wanted to sweep them away because they were so gorgeous, but they wouldn't. You know,
they didn't want that. They were not remotely interested in society with a capital S. They couldn't have been less interested. Their best friend on the Deb circuit was Jessica Mitford. And I tell a story about how when Jessica Mitford decided to elope with Esmond Romilly, her Churchill's first cousin and an avowed rebel anarchist and fighting in the Spanish Civil War, she gave the twins as her alibi for running off with him to France and thence to Spain. She was like them, you know, out to sort of subvert the system if she possibly could. No, they knew they'd never marry any of those men. They weren't remotely interested in them. And luckily for Mamaine, she met an extraordinary figure called Dick Wyndham, who was 20 years her senior, who was immensely wealthy, and who was bohemian to the end of his fingertips. And he fell absolutely hook, line, and sinker in love with Mamaine. And he introduced Mamaine and Celia to his world of the bohemian world of London, really. I mean, his closest friend was Sir Cheverel Sitwell, the youngest of the Sitwell siblings, Constant Lambert, the composer, Cyril Connolly and Peter Cornell. Cyril went on to found and run Horizon magazine, as you know. Matthew Smith, the painter, Freddie Mayer, the art dealer. I mean, he was a painter himself, a writer, a traveller. He owned a light aircraft. He flew all over the place. He owned fast cars. He apparently had a pet alligator called Queen Maud. He was deeply eccentric. He was wildly attractive. And he and Mamaine had an affair from 1936 or 7 until the middle of the war. And he introduced them, as I say, the twins, to his circle of writers, artists, intellectuals, philosophers, and they never looked back.
I feel as if I've come across the Paget twins many times in reading about the era. I mean, just when you mentioned Decca Mitford, and you know, we both know DJ Taylor, David Taylor, and his book Bright Young People. In fact, there's a picture in your book that if it's not in David's book, there's something very like it.
Yes.
Right. So the girls were part of this set, you know, this very, very glamorous pre-war set of unconventional people. So, I mean, I feel like reading The Quality of Love is kind of filled in a bit of the background in all kinds of stories, which is why it's such a fascinating read. But there's this wonderful quote from one of the letters. I think it's Mamaine. It's a dog's life having people want to marry one, she says.
I know, unkind as it sounds to say so, she qualified, but yes. They were always being pursued, and they had many more admirers than I even mentioned. I mean, as I say, I left an awful lot of people on the cutting room floor. I just had to. It would have been too ragbaggy if I hadn't. I had to exert my editorial control to a certain extent. And, you know, I chose the most important of, you know, the ones they really loved, the ones they really cared for.
Yes. And also the people who changed them and whom they changed. You know, it's this sort of steps and stages in life that they move on and they outgrow and they look for something new and different. So they form chapters in the life. I must say, Ariane, I mean, you're very distinguished, and you have the shortest biography I think I've ever seen in your book here. Ariane Bankes worked in publishing for many years before becoming a writer, critic, and curator. She lives in London. That is,
Yeah, well,
that's
there we
really
go.
very
It
modest.
sums it up. It sums it up.
Would you like to fill in a little bit more of the things that
Okay.
you've done?
Well, I absolutely loved my career in publishing. Publishing mainly nonfiction, a lot of history, a lot of biography. I worked for Andre Deutsch, Collins for many, many years, John Murray, and then I moved into art publishing. And since leaving publishing, I've done much more writing of my own, both articles, reviews, and I set up an arts festival called the Dovedale Arts Festival in the Peak District, which ran for many years. And I started curating exhibitions for Pallant House Gallery in Chichester. And so I've already done 2 exhibitions, one on David Jones, the poet painter, and the second on Julian Trevelyan. And I'm currently working on one to open this November at Pallant House on Dora Carrington, not Leonora, not the surrealist Leonora, but Dora Carrington, who was really on the edges of the Bloomsbury group. She was deeply, deeply in love with Lytton Strachey and lived in a menage with Lytton Strachey and later her husband, Rafe Partridge. And she was a wonderfully original artist who'd been part of that brilliant Slade generation of the 1910 to 13, Levinson, Mark Gertler, that era. And she was a very original and brilliant artist, a decorative artist as well as a painter. But very, very tragically, she took her own life after the death of Lytton Strachey in 1932. She felt that there was simply, even though she was only 38 years old, she felt there was no point in going on living without him. And I've often thought, actually, while I've been working on my book and working on this exhibition, that she loved Lytton Strachey in a way, slightly, that Memain loved Arthur Koestler. She believed in him very strongly as a writer and a thinker and an intellectual. And while Memain certainly didn't take her own life after leaving Arthur, nevertheless, the real zest, I think, went out of Memain's life after the breakdown of her marriage to Arthur, because he was such a vital, volcanic force. And I think that contributed actually to her illness and to her death. I really do. So interesting parallels there.
Yeah, and she also painted, is that right?
Yeah, she did a bit of painting. I'm talking to you from my cottage in the Peak District, which where I have several of her really lovely paintings on my walls, but she was completely untutored as a painter. But actually they're very lovely. They're very primitive in style, but they're utterly, utterly drenched with charm. They really are. I'm so glad I still have them, because I don't have very much. I have her letters and I have her paintings, and I never knew her, so that's a way of sort of getting closer to her.
Yeah, I mean, I think the intellectual and artistic projects never seem to stop, because they at one point they start learning ancient Greek, and that's something your mother kept up with. She having learned ancient Greek, she
read it every single day of her life. Every day after lunch, she would settle down on the sofa with whichever play or Homer or whatever she was currently reading, and her huge Liddell and Scott dictionary, and her little notebooks where she kept lists of all the new vocabulary, all the vocabulary she was trying to learn, and she read it every day till she died. And she insisted that I went to a school where I could learn ancient Greek as well, which was the Perse School in Cambridge. And I loved Greek. I did it for 4 years for my O-levels, my A-levels, and I absolutely adored it too. But I'm afraid to say that I've not kept it up since.
yeah. I mean, it's difficult. I sort of feel that
my mother was such an intellectual. She was genuinely very, very bright, very, very clever, and very curious about the world, a complete autodidact, but she could hold her own in any company. And one of the reasons we moved to Cambridge when we did was because most of our friends were Cambridge dons. And, she thrived in their company.
That was her milieu.
That was her milieu, yeah. Mm.
So we'll talk a little bit about Camus. I was very tickled to read that he sent you a teddy bear upon your birth, was it? Oh,
My
I mean,
dad, yeah.
that's pretty impressive.
I don't have it still, I'm afraid to say.
Oh,
But he was so fond of my mother. I mean, in a way, Camus is the hero of my book, I feel, because he was the man. I think he was the man that Memaine loved in the sort of best possible way. She met Camus in 1946 while she was in Paris with Arthur, and it was a coup de foudre on both sides. They were both attached to other people. Camus was married with young twins himself. She was absolutely committed to Arthur, but it was the feeling of attraction between them was so strong that despite herself, she wrote to my mother saying, I know, I should say no, but I feel that one only gets a chance like this. One's lucky even to get a chance like this once in one's life. And I feel I should take it. So they went away together for a week to Provence, a week during which they were never separated even for a minute. And they had a week of utter bliss, and they sort of explored the Luberon Valley, where Camus had wanted and subsequently did buy a property of his own in the village of Lomarin. They had an extraordinary week in which they both felt that they were the best of themselves, but that it was a little episode out of time, and they knew that it couldn't last. There was no question of them ditching their families or ditching, in Maine's case, ditching her relationship with Arthur. So they brought it to a close, and they tried to forget about one another, but they found it impossible. And it gradually segued into a very, very close friendship. They would see each other whenever they could. Camus came over to London with his wife Francine to stay with Memaine in 1948. She went whenever she could to Paris and would always see Camus. They wrote to each other constantly. They sent one another books and records and music and endless letters. And after her death, even before Memaine's death, he was very fond of my mother too. But after Memaine's death, he became even closer to my mother because he was so deeply attached to her. And he had that great, great bond with my mother. And I quote several letters between them about Memaine after her death, which are terribly moving, actually. They really are. And he stayed in touch with my mother until he died. In fact, his last letter to my mother was written just a couple of months before he died in a car crash in 1960, inviting her to go out and stay with him in the house in Lomarin, which he had first discovered, 6 years before with Memaine. 16 years before with Memaine.
I sometimes, when reading the book, I wondered if these guys who were so smitten with one or other of the twins ever kind of thought, well, I've broken up with that twin, but I really like spending time with this twin because she reminds me so much. I did wonder how their physical resemblance, they were identical.
My father first met Memaine. In fact, they were stuck on a train in 1940 during the war in France for several hours together, and he was very sort of taken with Memaine, and followed up when they were both returned to London. Through Memaine, he met my mother, and in fact, he switched his affections to my mother. But there you go. But it didn't, luckily for them, it didn't happen very often, and actually they never seemed to fall in love with the same people. That was really lucky thing. The same people may have been smitten by both of them, and I think, for instance, Sartre was deeply smitten with both of them, but not romantically, but very impressed with them and loved their company. But they didn't fall for the same guy, thank God.
Yes, maybe they didn't have quite the same tastes, but there's definitely this flavour of kind of trying guys out a little bit, trying ways of living, trying to find the way to live to the fullest, which is so tremendously appealing about the story that you tell. That they come across as such vivid and interesting characters. And it also made me think, you've got this treasure trove of letters. This is something that has gone out of, it's now historical, isn't it? We won't find treasure troves of beautifully handwritten letters anymore.
Well, they weren't all beautifully handwritten. They were quite often very difficult to decipher, especially Camus, funnily enough, because he wrote with a rather thick pen. So it took me quite a while to sort of get into the idiom of it before I found it, easy to decipher it. And then, of course, my French isn't nearly as fluent as my mother's was. So, but anyway, I got through them in the end with the help of some friends, I have to say. Yes, no, they were intrinsically unconventional. I mean, it was a very unconventional thing to make a pact with one another, as they did, not to attend one another's funerals. They didn't care what people thought of them. They just cared what motivated them and what they felt. And they happily lived out of wedlock. I mean, Mamaine lived with Arthur for 6 years, very happily, before she married him. They only married, really, because by that stage his divorce papers had come through from his first wife, and they were able to sort of formalize their union, but it never bothered either of them whether they were married or unmarried. They were intrinsically unconventional, which is why they loved the world, the sort of bohemian world into which they fell, and why
it bothered the relations, though, didn't it? It did bother the wealthy relations who were trying to sort of keep these girls somewhat on the straight and narrow.
Yes. There's a very funny comment from Mamaine about her aunt, who took an extremely dim view of all her lovers, because none of them was, as it were, eligible in the conventional way. And in the case of Arthur, he was a deracinated Jewish intellectual, and he wrote extraordinary books, which she never would have dreamt of reading herself. And she went around telling people that Mamaine was living with a 36th rate writer, which is quite something to say about Arthur Koestler, who did, after all, write Darkness at Noon and several other extremely important books, and was really one of the leading intellectuals of the day. But no, there was a culture gap, I think, between. But this was, in a way, their adopted family. Had their own father lived, they would have gone to university, they would have had a decent education, they would have gone to university. I'm perfectly sure of it. Their lives might have turned out very differently indeed.
Well, let's turn a little bit to Orwell. He is yet another star figure in the book. And I believe we mentioned David Taylor, who's written a great deal about Orwell. Did you were able to sort of work with him a little bit on his latest biography? You found new information, or
I mean, I certainly talked to David about things down the years. David was particularly interested, actually, in my mother's cousin Inez Holden, who's an extraordinarily fascinating character. Orwell's really, I think, perhaps Orwell's closest woman friend, with whom he collaborated on many ventures during the war, many writing projects, and to whom she was the first person that he visited when he came back to England on the news of the death of his wife. He just turned up on her doorstep. They were very, very close, and Inez was my mother's first cousin, and I have all Inez's papers, and David is fascinated by Inez, who we've certainly talked at great length about her, and he certainly knew that I haven't been able to tell David much that he didn't know before about my mother, because my mother gave all her letters to the Orwell archive, her letters from Orwell to the Orwell archive, bar one, and that one is his letter of proposal, which she felt was too personal to give to anyone. But really, he understood the strength of their friendship. Orwell did fall for my mother, and proposed to her several times, and she was deeply devoted to him, admired him, loved him as a friend, but was not attracted to him. He was also 17 years older than her, and by the time she met him in late 1945, he was a very ill man. So she didn't want to marry him. But again, the twins were simply brilliant at sort of deflecting men's desire for them into real, deep, and lasting friendships. And she and Orwell became very close friends. And even though they were separated, actually, subsequently, he went up to Jura, she went to Paris, but they corresponded throughout their time there. And then when she returned from Paris in early 1949, he was already ill. He was already in Cranham nursing home, actually. But she visited him almost immediately and carried on seeing him until he died. And she and Mamaine were both at the wedding lunch that David Astor and Sonia Orwell gave for the Orwell's wedding, which, of course, Orwell was too ill to attend. He had a civil marriage in his hospital room in UCL, but he couldn't possibly get out of bed and attend the wedding lunch. But they were both there. Both the twins were there. They were very close.
And Sonia Brownell, I understand that she can be seen as a bit of a controversial character, but your mother felt very warmly towards her, or Mamaine did. I'm getting them confused here. She comes across as a rather nice person in this book.
Oh, yes. They remained great friends. I remember Sonia used to come and stay with us when we were growing up. She was a very complicated person, Sonia. She was beautiful. She was voluptuous. She was clever. She saw herself as an intellectual. But my mother said, and I quote this in the book, she said she wasn't really an intellectual at heart. And what George Orwell saw in her was not the intellectual Sonia, but the woman, the sensual, attractive, warm, generous-hearted woman. That's what he fell for. But she sort of saw herself in a different skin and presented herself always as an intellectual, which didn't really suit her. And she was never a particularly happy woman. But my mother was very fond of her. They'd worked together at Horizon magazine in the early 40s under Cyril Connolly's editorship. And the friendship lasted well into my teenage years. Yes, until her death, actually. It wasn't a very close friendship, but it was a consistent one.
Was it fairly easy to get permission to, you quote a lot from letters. I mean, your mother's and Mamaine's letters are one thing, but you have these titans like Camus and Orwell. I mean, having worked in publishing, and actually the thought of Sonia Brownell, Sonia Orwell made me think of this. I gather she could be a bit of a stickler when it came to using making use of the estate. So did you have any problems at all?
Well, I was incredibly lucky because, firstly, Sonia died a long time ago. I didn't need to get permission for Orwell's letter of proposal to my mother, but in fact, I know Richard Blair, Orwell's son, who is a marvelously generous-hearted man, and he immediately said, "Of course you can reproduce it. Yes, absolutely, no problem there." And also, my mother had stayed close to Camus' daughter, Catherine, one of Camus' twins, who lives in Le Marin, in the house where Camus lived and her mother lived until she died. And I have picked up that friendship myself with Catherine. And Catherine was very kind in letting me reproduce all these letters from Camus, which was rather an exceptional gift because actually she's not generally allowing the publication of previously unpublished documents, but out of friendship for me and actually out of devotion to the memory of my mother, she let me reproduce anything I wanted to. So I had no problems there at all. And let me just think who else could have been problematic. No, I don't think, no, I mean, I had to clear a few small copyrights, but really I had no problems. And I had the blessing of both Richard Blair and Catherine Camus, which is a wonderful thing to have.
And coming into the story yourself, as you do as a little girl, And also there's a lovely memory of meeting Sacheverell, well, it's quite hard to say that, in Venice.
We always
So
called him Sashi. Yes.
Sashi's much easier to say.
Sashi. Easier to say.
So he's these people, again, you have this kind of double focus, don't you? Because Koestler is Uncle Arthur, quite extraordinarily. Was he a terrifying figure when you were growing up, or was he?
No, he wasn't terrifying. He was rather daunting because he didn't see the point of children at all. He thought children were a complete waste of space, which is why he had refused to have any of his own. But he was deeply fond of my mother. Again, actually, after Mamane's death, my mother being identical to Mamane, they became as close as any brother and sister-in-law could be. And he came to stay with us. We spent an enormous amount of time with Uncle Arthur, and he married his secretary, Cynthia. And they were a very important part of our lives, so we grew up with them. And he used to enthrall us with sort of amazing stories about the solar system and planets and gravity and goodness knows what. He also used to challenge us to quite terrifying games of chess and Chinese checkers, which, of course, needless to say, he always won. And then he would sort of stomp off in irritation that we hadn't given him a good enough game. Well, we were only about 5 years old at the time, my brother and I. You know, he just didn't really get children. But when I was 14, he decided that I was finally worth talking to. And he took me and my mother out to the most expensive restaurant in Cambridge that you could possibly find, ordered all the most expensive things on the menu and all the most expensive drinks on the menu. And he made a little speech announcing that I'd now come of age, as he put it, and, you know, I was worth talking to at last. And from that moment on, he treated me on a level. And it was wonderful for me because he took a huge interest in my education, what I was learning, what I was interested in, what I wanted to study. He was a real omnivore. You know, there were very few subjects on which he didn't have an incredible range and base of knowledge and great curiosity. And so he was the most wonderful companion. And we used to go and stay with them. They lived not far from us. And we always, when we went to dinner, we always stayed the night because we always knew that the conversation, and indeed the dinner, would go on well past midnight. He was a great talker. He was a great conversationalist. He was a great bon vivant. There was delicious food. There were delicious wines. And I learned so much from him. I loved my relationship with him once I sort of got onto a level, if you see what I mean. And we became really close, actually. Yeah.
And Freddie used to push you in a swing when you were very little. He seems to have been better with small children.
Yes, he had children of his own. He saw the point of children. No, I mean, so many of my mother's friends would come stay, and Laurie Lee was another one who we absolutely adored. And we just had great fun sort of playing pranks on them or playing pranks with them or whatever it was. All these sort of rather elderly intellectuals by then. And it was very happy childhood, actually.
Was it inevitable you'd go into books and publishing, do you think?
Well, yes, but I fought against it because it was so inevitable. The other thing that I just mentioned towards the end of my book is that as I grew up, my mother unconsciously and subliminally and absolutely unintentionally started to sort of draw parallels between me and Mamane. I think that Mamane's death had left such an enormous black gaping hole in her life. And as I genuinely shared so many interests and tastes, as it were, and likes and dislikes with my mother, I inevitably reminded her more and more and more of Mamane and the sort of conversations they would have. So she gradually, and I think completely unconsciously, rather sort of assumed that I would become very like Mamane, almost become a clone of Mamane, I think. And of course, I had to fight against that. I was a teenager. I wanted to be me. I didn't want to be my aunt. And so I deliberately, I often went against my own instincts just to be different, just to be not like Mamane, or not like what my mother thought I would be like. And I went off and did some social work, actually, but I always really wanted to go into publishing. And after a few years working for UNICEF, I perhaps social work is one I do, charity work. I inevitably just moved into publishing, and I felt very happy there. And I was a square peg in a square hole. And my mother was sort of delighted because, books had always been absolutely central to her life, and she could relive her whole publishing career through me in a way.
Were you ever tempted to write a childhood memoir of all the extraordinary people coming and going?
No, I always thought that I would write about the twins. Partly it was in an attempt to rediscover for myself this aunt whom I had never known, but whose voice through her letters and through the stories that Arthur and my mother told me, and others too, was obviously such an attractive and captivating one. And so this is a book that really, I didn't mind when I wrote it. It's been very, very long time in coming. I just knew I would always write in the end. And for me, there was no hurry. As long as I did it before I died, that was fine with me. But it's been a journey for me. It's been a really interesting journey. And as you say, it's a social history. It's also, a bit of a history of the beginning of the Cold War, because Orwell and Koestler, and to a certain extent Camus, were the absolute arch Cold Warriors. Of course, Koestler with Darkness at Noon, which was the first book really to show up the Soviet show trials, the Soviet system for what it was under Stalinism, and then Animal Farm in 1984. I mean, these are the key texts of the Cold War. And my mother and my maid, through their closeness to these writers, were drawn right into the epicenter of that really Manichaean battle between freedom and totalitarianism. They were right in the thick of it. And it is not so distant from where we are today. We're up against.
There are lots of echoes, aren't there?
There are so many echoes. There are such strong echoes now. It's extraordinary. It's almost as if it's a retread in some respects, and where they were 70 years ago.
Yeah. There's things like, trips to Palestine and reporting on the Middle East and all of this stuff has such, and Ukraine, it's all in there, weirdly enough.
Arthur and Maine went to Israel in May 1948 at the absolute beginning of the independent state of Israel, the end of the British Mandate. And they were given visa numbers 5 and 6. They were the 5th and 6th visitors to the newly minted state of Israel. And look at us now.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary. You are involved with Koestler Arts, I believe. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that is a wonderful legacy, isn't it?
It's a wonderful legacy, actually. So Arthur was a great campaigner. He was passionate about the causes he was passionate about. I mean, one of them was actually the abolition of capital punishment, which he worked on with David Astor. And it took many years, but eventually it was abolished in 1965. Capital punishment was abolished in the UK for murder. But when he was... He'd been a political prisoner 3 times. First of all, in the Spanish Civil War, where he spent 3 months on death row in Malaga, Franco's Spain, under sentence of death. He was sprung from that through influence, and because he was a very well-known journalist at the time. He was then thrown into an internment camp, an appalling, verminous internment camp in the south of France called Le Vernet, because he was Jewish, immigrant to France in 1939. It was a pretty dreadful place. Managed to get out of that after a few months, and then make his way, sort of cat and mouse game against the Nazis, make his way to Britain, whereupon he was immediately thrown into Pentonville jail for 6 weeks as an enemy alien while they checked his papers. So he spent 3 spells behind bars, and he realized that it could be, as he put it, the death of the soul. To have no means of self-expression, to be locked up with nothing but your own thoughts was absolutely sort of catastrophic for people. And so in 1962, he collaborated with David Astor again and Rab Butler, who was then Home Secretary, to set up the Koestler Trust for Arts in Prisons, which was an awards system to encourage those imprisoned in England to be creative. They could write poems, they could write stories, they could send in pictures, paintings, whatever. And he set the whole thing up with the Home Secretary. And we celebrated our 60th anniversary 2 years ago. And it's gone from strength to strength. It's now called Koestler Arts. And it is the most significant arts organisation working in the prison system in the UK. We work in every single establishment in the UK. We're completely embedded in the system. And it really is one of the few consistently positive things about the UK prison system. And it's an absolutely miraculous legacy. I mean, Arthur had no idea that it would become so big, that it would last so long, that it would affect so many people's lives. It would change so many people's lives. And he would be astonished and absolutely thrilled if he knew. And I'm now president of Koestler Arts, actually. Yeah. So I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled with that as well.
Thrilled to be carrying on.
Thrilled to be carrying on, because it was a really brilliant initiative.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about another thing? This is how we met, actually, the Biographers Prize that are you still involved with the Biographers Prize?
Yes. So I'm on the committee of the Biographers Club, and we run two prizes. But the one that Suzi was a judge for is now been renamed, because it's now sponsored by Hatchards, the Hatchards and Biographers Club First Biography Prize, and it does what it says on the tin. So we award a prize every year of £2,500 to the best first biography or memoir. And we have 3 very distinguished judges that change every year. Yeah. And it's a terrific prize. And if you know anybody who's written a first biography or memoir, please really tell them about it and encourage them to apply through the Biographers Club website. And you won't get Suzi to judge this year, sadly, but she'll probably
I had a lot of fun doing it. I mean, I had such lovely fellow judges, and it was one of those judging experiences where everybody was on the same page, you know.
Oh, good. Yes. Well, we were sponsored very, very generously when you did it, Suzi, by Slightly Fox. They sponsored us for a whole decade. Yeah. But the moment that they stepped down, Hatchards picked up the baton. So this year is the first year of the renamed prize, the Hatchards Best First Biography Prize.
Wonderful.
And maybe you'll do it again in future.
Oh, I'm glad it's still going. I remember we had a lovely meal, I think, at Brasserie Odell, and there's nothing nicer than tucking into good food and really, you know, discussing your wonderful books. And the other thing about the prize is that you weren't sort of overwhelmed with entries. You know, if you get a mass of entries, you're speed reading and chucking things away, and it was nicely curated from the judge's point of view. There was some absolutely terrific books the year I did it, so it was very, very enjoyable. I will now let's move on to the final 3 questions. I will just recap. We've been talking about this wonderful book published by Duckworths. It's just come out. Fantastic read. So if you love any of those writers, Orwell, Koestler, Camus, this is the book to read. So I will now go on to the questions that I have furnished you with beforehand. So let's hear what your favourite artwork is.
Okay, I mean, I don't have an image of it to hand, but the main was given by an admirer in the 1930s, the most beautiful drawing by Picasso of 2 dancers from the Ballet Russe. Picasso did a lot of sketches of these dancers when they were down in Monte Carlo, and his wife Olga Koklova was one of the ballerinas at the time. And it is a ravishing, fabulous drawing, and I grew up with it. It was given to Mame, it was inherited by my mother. We grew up with it above our fireplace, and it's now it's hanging above my desk where I do all my work. So that's my favourite artwork of all, I think. Yes, I'm so sorry I don't have, well, I do have an image, but I'd have to share my screen. It might all be very complicated.
Right. Okay. No, I think you've painted a picture in our head. What a fabulous thing.
It really is a lovely thing. Yes.
It's not normally an artwork that somebody possesses, so that might be a new one.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yes. Well, I happen to
No,
possess
it's
it.
really good. If it's your favourite artwork, it is your
Yeah.
favourite artwork. So that's
I mean, I
wonderful.
think when whichever admirer it was gave it to Mamain, he probably bought it for the, 5 francs or something.
Yes.
It was really nothing, it was just a sketch, but it is a thing of beauty.
Yeah. How lovely. That's very special. And it also it's a tribute to Mamain, as
Yes,
we've
well, it
been
is. And that's
talking
another
about.
reason I love it, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the Book of Shame
Oh,
is a book that people would be surprised to hear that you hadn't read, perhaps. So do you have a
well,
Book of Shame?
well, I
We
have
all
several
do,
books of
really.
shame, many books of shame. Ulysses by James Joyce is one of them. But actually, I've chosen Life and Fate by Valerie Grossman because it's a masterpiece. And I have started it. This is the shameful, shameful thing. It's so long. I've got it here. It is, it's 1,000 pages, basically. And it is incredibly complicated and it has a cast of thousands. And basically, I haven't given it enough time and attention. So I've started it in the normal way that I read, for 20 minutes and then I fall asleep at night. And you can't do that with this book. You simply have to immerse yourself in it 100%, 24/7. And I need to take a holiday in order to read Life and Fate from start to finish because it's an absolute masterpiece. And I'm very ashamed that I only got 100 pages in and then I started forgetting who was who.
Well, the other thing is that there's always something that you have to read for one reason or another.
Yes, exactly. I know my friends keep writing books and sending them to me.
It's horrible. Horrible of them, I know. Ulysses it's probably the #1 book of shame in the book bag,
sure.
actually.
Yes.
There are possibly more people who claim to have read Ulysses than actually have read Ulysses. I wouldn't be at all surprised. So you don't need to feel too ashamed about that.
I do feel ashamed about it, actually.
And the last question is about feedback. Have you had any funny or eccentric or bizarre feedback on any aspect of your work? It doesn't have to be this book because this book is just out new, but what have you got?
As it happens, there was a centerfold double-page spread of this book last weekend in the Daily Mail. And when I looked at the comments online, of which there was 71, there was some very funny ones. And I just wanted to read 3 very brief comments that I had about this book. First one, listen up, kids. Forget TikTok and changing sex. Just grab a few books by these authors and let greatness engulf you. I love that. Then the second one about Celia and the Main. Real women. No silicone breasts, no fillers, minimal makeup, and brains. And the third one is, blimey, I need a drink after reading that. And they made me laugh. So I thought I would share them with you.
Oh, those are lovely. I mean, it does take me back to something I thought about the girls, the women, as I was reading, that they were stunning looking. And they seem to have done a little bit of impromptu modelling when they were very young and, the debutante era in these fabulous gowns and frocks. But actually, the clothing is smart but plain and simple. They seem to like, practical skirts and trousers and jumpers. That seems to have been their style.
Yeah. They were, on the whole, jeans and jumpers. Very, very downbeat. And they didn't. My mother wore virtually no makeup, actually. So she just didn't bother. And I don't think they needed to. They could get away with it. Lucky them.
No. It's very enviable. I am left with that idea that it is a dog's life having men fling themselves at you. I'm going to take that away as consolation that it can be quite hard work dealing with randy intellectuals in 3 different languages.
You summed it up. You've really summed it up.
So yes, brilliant book. Well done. I think it's an absolutely terrific read. And you've, like I say, you filled in all sorts of, you've kind of shaded in the background beautifully. So, they're not just these figures, these titanic men who come out of nowhere. There's stuff going on behind that's equally interesting. So yes, a woman who stands up for herself. These girls certainly did. Thank you very much for joining me in the book bag, Ariane
I've
Bankes.
really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Suzi. I've loved it. Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, and thank you very much for watching. Join me next time when I will get another wonderful author for you, and we'll have another chat about all things literary. But for the meantime, goodbye and thank you.